My millionaire wife's parents forced me to sign a humiliating prenup because they called me a gold digger. I worked 18-hour days for 8 years. Now my company is worth 5 times their fortune, and they came begging to dissolve the agreement. What I told them left them broken. I'm 37 years old. I own an electronics company that, I'm not going to be modest, is doing pretty well. And I need to tell this story because what happened a few months ago with my in-laws still has my head all messed up. Although, there's also a part of me that feels incredibly satisfied with how things turned out. I guess I should start from the beginning, when I met Michelle like 11 years ago, because without that context, none of this makes sense. I came from a completely normal family. I mean, my dad, Paul, was a high school football coach, and my mom, Nancy, managed a coffee shop downtown. So we weren't rich, but we didn't lack anything either. You know what I mean? I grew up knowing what hard work was because my parents always did it. And when I finished college, I got a sales job that paid decent, but nothing special. That's where I met Michelle. She worked in the same building, but for another company. And honestly, from the first moment I realized there was something special about her. I don't know. She had that positive energy that makes you feel good just being around her. We started dating and everything was going perfect, like really perfect. She was smart and funny and supportive of everything, and I was completely in love. Obviously, at some point, I had to meet her parents, Edward and Judith, and that's when things got weird. From the very first moment, literally from the second I crossed the door of their house, a huge mansion, by the way, because they own a super successful real estate firm, I felt like they were evaluating me and finding all the ways I wasn't good enough for their daughter. Edward barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was with that condescending tone that makes you feel like you're a child. And Judith smiled, but in that fake way where you know inside she's thinking something completely different. The thing is that at that time, I was working on my plan to launch my own electronics business because I'd always been good with technology, and I saw a real opportunity in the market. So like 2 years after starting to date Michelle, I quit my job and went all in on building the company. Michelle was incredible during that whole period. She supported me financially when I needed it and emotionally when things got tough, which was many times at the beginning because starting a business isn't easy at all. Basically, I worked like 18 hours a day, and there were weeks where I didn't see a single cent of profit. When I was 29 years old, I proposed to Michelle, and she obviously said yes. We planned the wedding for within a year, and I was over the moon, thinking that finally everything was falling into place. My business was growing, slowly but steadily. I wasn't a millionaire, but I was already starting to see real results, and I thought that maybe her parents would start to see me differently. How wrong I was. Like 6 months before the wedding, Edward and Judith asked us to meet at their house to discuss some important details about the marriage. I thought they were going to talk about the ceremony or something like that, but no. What they did was put a prenuptial agreement on the table and explain to us that it was necessary to protect Michelle. The way they said it was so condescending, Judith literally said something like, "It's nothing personal, Ryan, but you know how these things are. We want to make sure our daughter is protected in case things don't work out." And Edward added that it was just a standard precaution, considering the difference in their financial situations. The prenup basically said that all assets would remain separate, that Michelle's was Michelle's and mine was mine, and here comes the part that really insulted me. It specified that I would have to repay any financial support I had received from Michelle during our time together if we ever got divorced. I mean, not only did they assume I was a gold digger who was with their daughter for money, but they also wanted to make sure that if things ended, I wouldn't keep anything from their family. Michelle got furious with them, told them it was ridiculous and offensive, and that she completely trusted me. But her parents didn't budge an inch. Edward basically gave us an ultimatum. Either we signed the prenup, or they wouldn't give their blessing for the marriage and wouldn't help at all with the wedding. I sat there feeling humiliated, because it didn't matter that my business was growing or that I worked like crazy every day. To them, I was still the middle-class guy who didn't deserve their daughter. In the end, Michelle and I signed the damn prenup, not because we agreed, but because we wanted to get married and not let her parents ruin that. But I swear that while I was signing each page, I promised myself that someday I would prove to them that they were completely wrong about me. Michelle hugged me afterward and told me she had never doubted me and that her parents were idiots, and that helped a little, but the insult was still there, you know? You don't forget when people treat you like you're trash. We got married, and the following years were intense, but good. My business kept growing little by little, and Michelle and I were building a life together. And we had our son Alexander like 2 years after getting married, and honestly, that kid became the center of our world. I worked like a madman during all those years. I reinvested almost all the profits in the company, hired good people, expanded operations, and slowly but surely things were starting to really take off. Edward and Judith continued being distant with me, like they would come visit Alexander and were loving grandparents with him. But with me, they barely spoke, and when they did, it was with that attitude of superiority that they never lost. Michelle fought with them constantly about how they treated me, but they always had some excuse, that it wasn't personal, that they only wanted the best for her, blah blah blah. But here's where the story gets interesting, because it turns out that in the last 2 years my business exploded in a way I didn't even expect myself. We got big contracts with major distributors, launched a product line that went viral, and suddenly I was billing amounts of money that honestly I had trouble processing. I hired accountants and financial advisors, and they all told me the same thing, that my company was worth millions, that I was officially rich, not just comfortable, but really rich. I did some calculations with my accountant like 6 months ago and realized that my net worth was approximately 5 times greater than Edward and Judith's. 5 times. Let me repeat that because I like how it sounds. I now had 5 times more money than the people who had forced me to sign a prenup because they thought I was a middle-class gold digger who would never be anything. Michelle and I moved to a bigger house, bought better cars, we could afford luxuries we hadn't even dreamed of before, and I honestly thought her parents would be happy that their daughter was doing so well, but no. Honestly, I think it bothered them. They started making weird comments about how we spent money, about whether we really needed so much ostentation, and I just smiled and said nothing because I knew it was eating them up inside. Like 3 months ago, Edward and Judith came to our house on a Sunday, said they needed to talk to us about something important, and I thought that maybe finally they were going to apologize for how they'd treated me all these years. How naive, right? We sat in the living room and Edward went straight to the point, said they'd been thinking and believed it was time to dissolve the prenuptial agreement we'd signed 8 years ago. I sat there staring at them, unable to believe what I was hearing, and Judith added with that fake smile they have, that the prenup had been a good idea at the time, but now circumstances had changed and it really didn't make sense to keep it, that we were family, and family didn't need those kinds of legal documents between them. The audacity of these people, seriously, the absolute audacity. I asked Edward, with the calmest voice I could manage, if he remembered why exactly they had insisted on the prenup in the first place, and he got a little uncomfortable and said something about protecting Michelle. And I said, "Oh yeah, protecting her from what exactly? From me? From the guy who apparently was only with her for her money, right?" And the room immediately got tense. Michelle looked at me like knowing exactly where I was going with this, and her parents looked clearly uncomfortable. Judith tried to smooth things over, saying they had never thought that about me, that they'd just been cautious like any responsible parent, and I couldn't help but laugh. I told them to please not insult me by lying to my face, that we all knew exactly what they'd thought of me and why they'd forced that prenup. I reminded them of every condescending comment, every look of disdain, every time they'd made me feel less than nothing, and told them that now that I had more money than them, suddenly the prenup wasn't a good idea anymore. Edward turned red with fury and started yelling that I was ungrateful, that they had supported Michelle when she was supporting me, that without his daughter I wouldn't have gotten anywhere, and that the least I could do was show some gratitude and respect. I answered him, staying surprisingly calm, considering I was furious inside, that the prenup had a specific clause about repaying any financial support and that I would be happy to comply with that, but dissolving the agreement wasn't going to happen because it had been their idea in the first place, and now they would have to live with that decision. Judith started crying, that manipulative crying some people use when they're not getting what they want, and said she couldn't believe I was being so cruel and vindictive with them, that they only wanted peace in the family, and I was destroying that out of pride. I told her it wasn't pride, it was principles, that they had made it very clear 8 years ago that they and I weren't family, and I was just respecting those boundaries they themselves had established. The argument got worse. Edward was pointing his finger at me, saying I had always been resentful and bitter, that I had never been good enough for his daughter, and now I was proving exactly what kind of person I was. Michelle finally intervened and told her parents to calm down, that I had every right to be angry after how they'd treated me, but Edward didn't listen. He kept yelling until finally he stood up and told Michelle she had to choose, either us or him, and they left the house slamming the door. I thought that would be the end of it, but no. During the following weeks, we received constant messages from them. Calls, emails, trying to convince Michelle that I was being irrational and controlling, that she should consider divorcing me, because I clearly didn't have the family's best interests in mind. Basically, they were trying to brainwash my wife into leaving me, and every message I read made me more and more furious. Michelle was devastated, like she cried at night because she hated being in the middle of all this, and that made me feel bad because the last thing I wanted was to cause her pain. But at the same time, I wasn't going to let her parents walk all over me again. I made the decision to end this once and for all. I talked to my accountant and my lawyer and asked them to calculate exactly how much money Michelle had spent supporting me during the first years of my business. Every cent. The number was considerable. Like $50,000 in total between everything. So I transferred that complete amount to a new account and called Edward. I told him I was going to go to his house to give him a check for the total amount plus interest, that with that any debt I had with his family would be completely settled, and after that, I never wanted to hear from them again. I thought they would accept the money happily, and that would be it. But no. Edward told me he didn't want my damn money. That this wasn't about money, but about respect and family. I responded that it was very interesting. He said that considering they were the ones who made everything about money, when they forced me to sign that prenup, and that if it really was about respect, then they should start by showing some respect toward me. He hung up on me, and I honestly thought that maybe with time they would calm down and we could find some kind of civilized truce, but I didn't know my in-laws as well as I thought. Like 2 weeks later, a Tuesday afternoon, I was working from home when I heard someone knocking on the door insistently. I opened it, and there were Edward and Judith without having warned they were coming. Judith pushed the door and entered without me inviting her. Edward followed her, and both started yelling that they needed to speak with their daughter immediately. Michelle was upstairs with Alexander. She ran down when she heard the commotion, and her parents basically attacked her with a bunch of accusations about how I was manipulating her and alienating her from her family. Michelle told them to calm down, that they couldn't just show up at our house without warning and behave like that, but they weren't listening. Edward pointed at me and told Michelle that if she really loved him as a daughter, she would have to remove me from her life. That I was toxic and only wanted her money, which was ironic considering I had more money than all of them combined at this point. Judith cried and begged Michelle not to let me destroy their family, that they loved her and only wanted to protect her. Michelle stood there, staring at her parents, and I could see she was processing everything, all the years of derogatory comments toward me, all the times they'd tried to make her feel guilty for being with me, all the ways they'd tried to control her life. And then something happened that I'll never forget. Michelle stood between her parents and me, and told them with a cold voice I'd never heard from her, that she had already chosen, that she had chosen 11 years ago when she decided to be with me, and she had chosen again when she married me, and she chose now every day she woke up by my side. She told them that they were the ones who had destroyed the family relationship with their constant lack of respect toward her husband, that from the beginning they had treated me like I wasn't good enough without giving me a real chance, that they had humiliated me with that ridiculous prenup, and now that things had changed, they wanted to rewrite history and act like they'd always been fair to me. She told them that if they wanted to be part of her life, and Alexander's life, they would have to earn that right by demonstrating real respect, not just empty words but real actions. Edward tried to interrupt her, but Michelle raised her hand and told him to shut up, that he'd said enough, that she'd listened to their complaints and manipulations for weeks, and she was fed up. She told Judith to stop using tears to manipulate situations because it didn't work on her anymore, that she was an adult with her own family, and her husband and son were her priority now, not appeasing parents who had never been able to accept her decisions. Judith asked her through sobs how she could do this to them, how she could choose a stranger over her own blood, and Michelle responded that I wasn't a stranger, that I was her husband and the father of her child, and that the only reason there was family tension was because they had refused for years to accept him. She told them she loved them but couldn't continue having a relationship with them if they continued disrespecting me. that they had to decide what was more important, their pride and classism or having a relationship with their daughter and grandson. Edward told her she was going to regret it, that she was making the biggest mistake of her life, and Michelle just told them they needed to leave her house, that when they were ready to behave like adults and treat her family with respect, they could talk, but until then, she didn't want to see them. She practically pushed them toward the door. And I stood there kind of in shock because I didn't expect Michelle to be so direct with them, but at the same time I felt proud of her for finally setting boundaries. After they left, Michelle collapsed a little, cried in my arms for like an hour, and I just held her and told her I was sorry she had to go through this, but I completely supported her in whatever decision she made. She told me she was tired of living trying to please people who were never going to be satisfied, that she'd spent her whole life trying to be the perfect daughter and realized that for her parents nothing would be enough unless it was exactly what they wanted. That night we blocked Edward and Judith everywhere. Phones, emails, social media, everything. We talked to Alexander about why he wasn't going to see his grandparents for a while, trying to explain it in a way a 7-year-old could understand without scaring him, and he basically said it was okay because he had mom and dad, and that was what mattered. Kids are sometimes wiser than we think, right? It's been like 3 months since all that, and we haven't heard anything from my in-laws. I heard through Michelle that they're trying to contact her through other relatives, but she's made it clear she's not interested in reconciling until there's a real apology and genuine change in attitude. Honestly, I don't know if that's ever going to happen. People like Edward and Judith rarely admit they're wrong, especially about something they've held on to for so long. My business keeps growing. I'm planning to open a second office next year, and the projections are even better than this year, so economically we're more than fine. Michelle went back to work part-time doing something she's passionate about now that Alexander is older, and honestly, our life is pretty good without the constant drama of her parents trying to guilt-trip or manipulate us. Sometimes Michelle gets sad when she thinks about how things could have been different if her parents had been more open and less prejudiced from the beginning. But I tell her it's not worth thinking about those what-ifs. The reality is that they chose to see me a certain way and were never willing to change that perspective, even when all the evidence showed they were wrong. The other day, Alexander asked me if Grandma and Grandpa were coming for his birthday next month. I told him probably not, and he shrugged and told me it was okay, because his party was going to be fun anyway. He didn't seem especially affected by their absence in his life, which is both sad and revealing, because I think even at his age, he could feel the tension and constant conflict when they were around. I'm not going to lie and say there isn't a part of me that feels vindicated by all this. After years of being treated like I was worth nothing, of having my intentions and capabilities questioned, of feeling like a stranger in my own wife's family, I can finally look back and say I was right, that I was always right. I wasn't with Michelle for her money. I was with her because I loved her and she loved me. And we built something real together based on mutual respect and genuine support. That prenup they forced me to sign, the document that was supposed to humiliate me and put me in my place, ended up being the instrument of their own defeat. They wanted to protect their family's money from me, and now it turns out I have more money than them, and that agreement is there, permanently reminding them of their error in judgment. It's poetic in a way, isn't it? I didn't plan for things to turn out this way. I just worked hard and had some luck, but I can't deny there's real satisfaction in knowing they were so completely wrong about me. I think sometimes about whether I should have handled things differently when they came, asking to dissolve the prenup, if maybe I should have been more diplomatic or less direct about my resentment. But honestly, I think the outcome would have been the same eventually. The problem was never really about the prenup or the money. It was about respect and acceptance, and they were never willing to give it to me. I simply got tired of pretending I didn't care, of being the nice guy who accepts being treated like a second-class citizen in his own family. Michelle told me a few days ago that she doesn't regret anything, that she should have set boundaries with her parents years ago, and she was sorry I had to endure so much before she finally stood firm. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that I understood family is complicated and it hadn't. I've been easy for her to be in the middle of all this. But the truth is we came out stronger as a couple from all this mess. I think facing this together showed us we can really trust each other when things get tough. I don't know what's going to happen in the future with Edward and Judith. If they'll ever swallow their pride enough to attempt a real reconciliation, or if they're going to maintain their position and permanently lose the relationship with their daughter and grandson. That decision is completely in their hands now. We made clear what the terms are, and they have to decide what's more important to them. For now, I'm focused on my family, on continuing to build my business, on being a good husband to Michelle and a good father to Alexander. The drama with the in-laws was exhausting while it lasted, but it also taught me something important about not letting other people define you or make you feel less than what you are. I know who I am, I know what I've achieved, and I don't need Edward and Judith's validation to feel good about myself. Last week, I was playing with Alexander in the yard, and Michelle came out with lemonade for the three of us, and in that moment, I thought, this is what really matters. These simple moments with the people you love and who love you back without conditions or prejudices. Everything else, the money, the success, the vindication over my in-laws, is secondary to this.